The year was 1252. The air inside the papal chamber of inquiry hung heavy with incense, dust, and the slow tolling of the bell from St. Peter's Basilica. It was here, behind carved oak doors, that Pope Innocent IV signed a parchment that would stain the conscience of the Church for centuries. His fingers trembled slightly, not from hesitation, but from the weight of power. The document was simple, a papal bull titled Ad Extirpanda. Its purpose was to protect the faith from heresy. Yet its consequence was far darker. It legalized torture in the name of salvation. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, cardinals stood in crimson robes, their faces a mask of obedience. They murmured prayers as wax candles dripped slow tears onto the stone floor. Outside, the rain struck the marble statues of saints, echoing like whispers of disapproval. One man among them, Inquisitor Father Mateo, felt his heart stir. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes like a storm about to break. He had spent years chasing heretics across the Italian countryside. But never had he seen God's will written so clearly and so cruelly. That night, in the dungeons below the Vatican, the first test began. The inquisitors gathered in silence, their faces half hidden by hoods. The prisoner, a young scholar accused of spreading forbidden translations of the gospel, stood trembling under the dim light of an oil lamp. His wrists were bound behind him, his tunic torn. Father Mateo observed him quietly, studying not just his defiance but his fear. "Let it begin," Mateo whispered. A heavy rope dangled from the ceiling, looped through a pulley. The guards seized the prisoner, lifted his arms backward until the shoulders strained against their sockets. A single order followed: hoist. The man rose into the air, his body twisting, joints screaming silently against the strain. No blood was drawn, only the slow, wet sound of muscles tearing. The inquisitors watched him passively, murmuring Latin verses. It was a spectacle not of cruelty, but of obedience. The Pope's new law required that no blood be shed. This was the perfect instrument of sanctified suffering. Father Mateo's face remained unreadable. Inside, however, a storm raged. "Is this salvation?" he wondered. The man before him cried out, not blasphemy, not hatred, only pain. The sound echoed down the stone corridor, swallowed by the weight of sanctity. Hours passed. The rope was lowered, then lifted again, each motion more precise than the last. The prisoner's body dangled like a broken marionette, the eyes rolling back, breath shallow. When at last he collapsed to the ground, he did not speak a word. His silence, Mateo realized, was more terrifying than confession. Later, alone in his chamber, Mateo opened his journal. He wrote in a shaking hand, "We claim to purge the soul, yet I fear we unmake it. The rope does not judge, it only obeys." The candle flickered as thunder rolled outside. He stared at his ink-stained fingers, as if they too bore guilt. In the courtyard, bells rang for vespers. The city prayed above ground, unaware that beneath their feet, faith and flesh were being twisted together into something unholy. Weeks passed. The papal edict spread like wildfire across Christendom. Monasteries from Avignon to Toledo adopted the new method, praising its cleanliness. No blood meant no sin, or so they said. Yet, within every echoing dungeon, the same cries rose again and again, human voices reshaped into instruments of doctrine. One evening, as Mateo descended once more into the Vatican cellars, he found a new prisoner waiting. A woman, this time her name, Lucia, a healer from the countryside, accused of heresy for claiming to see visions of angels. Her hair was black streaked with gray, her eyes defiant even as chains bound her wrists. She looked at Mateo not with fear, but with recognition. "You believe in mercy," she said quietly. "I can see it in your face." Mateo hesitated. For a moment, the dungeon seemed to breathe stone walls, exhaling centuries of despair. He gestured to the guards, voice low. "Prepare the rope." Lucia closed her eyes as the pulley creaked. The rope tightened around her wrists. The candlelight painted long shadows on the wall, her silhouette rising like a crucifix. As she was lifted, she did not scream. Instead, she whispered a prayer. Father Mateo turned away. He had executed many orders in the name of the church, but tonight, his faith trembled. He could no longer tell where obedience ended and cruelty began. When it was over, he remained alone in the chamber. The air smelled of wax and sweat. On the floor lay the rope, coiled like a serpent, its fibers darkened with human oil. Mateo knelt beside it, whispering, "Forgive us, Lord, for we know exactly what we do." Outside, dawn broke over Rome, painting the city gold. The bells rang again, heralding another day of holiness. Yet beneath those bells, beneath marble and prayer, the first echoes of the Strappado would continue an invention, baptized not in blood, but in silence. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the Vatican courtyard like liquid gold, washing the marble saints in divine glow. To the pilgrims kneeling below, it was another day of worship, another morning of salvation. But deep beneath that same courtyard, where no light could reach, Father Mateo stood in the silence of the interrogation chamber. Staring at the coiled rope that lay upon the ground dot, it was still damp from last night. He thought of Lucia, the way she refused to scream, the way her eyes, even under unbearable strain, reflected not hatred, but forgiveness. Why did she pray for me? The question had followed him through the night, through the echo of church bells and the whisper of Latin hymns behind him. The heavy wooden door creaked open. Brother Silas entered, Mateo's assistant, younger, zealous, with the certainty of youth burning in his gaze. "She has not confessed, Father," Silas said. "The tribunal demands another session." Mateo turned slowly. "She will die if we continue. Her death would cleanse her soul." "Or stain ours," Mateo murmured. Silas frowned, confused. "But the Holy Father has decreed." "Yes," Mateo interrupted. "He decreed we may use the rope, not that we must." The tension between them hung in the air. In that brief silence, the faint sound of chanting from the chapel above drifted down, the same voices praising mercy, while cruelty thrived beneath. Mateo rubbed his temples. He could still feel the faint tremor in his own hands, the phantom weight of the rope pulling at his conscience. That evening, he returned to Lucia's cell. The air smelled of damp stone and oil smoke. She was sitting against the wall, her wrists bruised but her eyes calm. When he entered, she looked up, not with defiance, but quiet knowing. "You came back," she said. "I came to ask why you did not scream." Mateo replied. She smiled faintly. "Because pain is not the worst thing a soul can endure." "And what is?" "To watch another man lose his soul and be unable to stop him." Her words struck him like a blade. He wanted to look away but couldn't. "You think I've lost mine?" "No," she said softly. "You're still fighting for it." For a long moment, they said nothing. The only sound was the distant dripping of water and the faint echo of footsteps above. Finally, Mateo asked, "Do you still believe your visions come from angels?" "I don't need to see angels," Lucia whispered. "I only need to know that love does not come from pain." Mateo turned toward the crucifix on the wall, its shadow long and distorted. Had the church forgotten that once even Christ had screamed? The next day, the tribunal assembled. 3 cardinals in red sat behind a long table, parchment spread before them like weapons. The chamber was lit by dozens of candles, but the air remained cold. Cardinal Ferrante, the eldest, addressed Mateo. "Father, has the accused confessed?" "No, Eminence." "Then proceed with another application of the rope. The faith must be defended." Mateo hesitated. His heart pounded. He could feel Silas's eyes on him, burning with obedience. "I fear she will not survive." Ferrante's gaze hardened. "Then God will judge her swiftly." There was no escape. Under the weight of centuries of doctrine, Mateo bowed his head. "As you command." The guards brought Lucia once more into the chamber. She limped, but her chin remained high. The rope awaited, dangling from the iron hook above. Candlelight danced across her face, illuminating her calm defiance. Mateo approached slowly, his breath shallow. "Lucia," he whispered, "I cannot stop this." "Yes, you can," she said quietly. "You need only stop believing that obedience is holiness." Her words burned through him. But the cardinals were watching, and the law of the church was absolute. The guards seized her arms, binding them again behind her back. The pulley groaned. "Hoist." The rope tightened. Her body lifted once more. She gasped, not in agony but in prayer. "Forgive them, Lord." Mateo turned away, fists clenched. The sound of the pulley creaking echoed like thunder in his skull. He could no longer tell whether the sound came from the rope or from something breaking inside him. Afterward, Lucia was carried out unconscious. Mateo remained alone, staring at the empty noose. The candlelight flickered across the walls like restless souls. His shadow stretched beside him, warped, unholy. That night, he dreamed. In his sleep, he saw the rope descend from heaven like a serpent made of light. It wrapped around his wrists, lifted him into the air, and whispered in a voice that was his own, "You are both the torturer and the tortured." He awoke drenched in sweat. The bells tolling for Matin Estat in the morning, he went to the cardinal's chamber. "I can no longer serve the tribunal," he said. Ferrante's face darkened. "You speak of disobedience? I speak of conscience." The cardinal leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Conscience is a luxury of heretics, Father Mateo." For the first time, Mateo did not bow. "Then perhaps I am one." He walked out into the light of the courtyard, the sun blinding after so many days underground. He could still hear the chanting of monks behind him, voices praising God in harmony, unaware of the shadows they fed. Above him, the doves circled the bell tower. And for the first time, Father Mateo prayed not for forgiveness but for courage. The wind that swept through the Vatican that morning carried the scent of incense and old secrets. Father Mateo moved through the cloisters like a ghost, his black robe whispering against the marble floor. The sun, high above, illuminated the mosaics of saints who had once burned for their faith. And for a fleeting moment, Mateo wondered if they too had ever doubted heaven. After his defiance in front of Cardinal Ferrante, whispers had begun to crawl through the corridors. "The Inquisitor has lost his faith," they murmured. The rope broke more than the heretic, but no one dared confront him directly. He was still the Church's chosen instrument, for now, he sought solitude in the catacombs, beneath the old basilica. Few came here. Even the priests avoided the lower chambers, where the air grew heavy with dust and prayer. The walls were lined with bones, stacked neatly like the pages of forgotten scripture. Here, in the silence of the dead, Mateo felt the weight of his conscience pressing upon him. He lit a candle and whispered, "Forgive me, Lord, for I have obeyed too much." The flame flickered, and for a heartbeat, he thought he heard an answer. A voice, faint and dry as old parchment, seemed to breathe from the stones themselves. "Obedience without mercy is not faith, but fear." Mateo froze. He turned, holding the candle high, but the corridor was empty. Only the shadows moved. He pressed a trembling hand to the wall. The cold stone thrummed beneath his palm, alive somehow, like it carried the voices of centuries. He stumbled back, heart racing. "Who speaks?" he whispered, but there was no reply. Only the echo of his own breath. That night, he could not sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucia's face, pale, serene, and unbroken. The sound of the rope creaking haunted him like a prayer turned inside out. He knelt before his crucifix, whispering desperate questions. "Lord, if obedience leads to cruelty, then whose will have I served? Silence. Until suddenly, from the corridor outside his chamber, came the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Mateo rose, clutching his rosary. The door creaked open by itself, and a draft of cold air swept through. He followed the sound into the hall, candlelight flickering wildly against the frescoes of saints and martyrs out at the far end of the corridor. The great tapestry depicting the Archangel Michael seemed to move. The angel's embroidered wings shimmered, not with divine light, but with something darker. Mateo lifted the edge of the tapestry and found a narrow passage behind it, one he had never seen before. He entered. The passage wound downward, deeper than any catacomb he had known. The air smelled of rust and salt. And as he descended, the whispering returned. They suffer still, the rope remembers. The walls seemed to pulse, as though breathing with the collective memory of those who had screamed here. Mateo's candle guttered, then died. Darkness consumed him. He could feel the stone beneath his fingertips, wet and trembling. Then, a sudden glow appeared ahead, faint, bluish, like moonlight filtered through water. He stepped forward and found himself in a vast circular chamber. In its center hung the old Strappado, its ropes frayed but intact. And kneeling beside it, head bowed, was a figure. Lucia? Mateo whispered. The figure raised its face, but it was not Lucia. It was an old man in tattered vestments, his eyes clouded white. "Do you hear them?" he croaked. "The walls. They remember every confession, every cry. They echo through the centuries until someone listens." "Who are you?" Mateo asked. The old man smiled faintly. "I was what you are, an Inquisitor. And like you, I thought I served God, until the walls spoke." Mateo felt a chill crawl up his spine. What do they want? To be heard. To be freed. The air trembled. The old man's form began to dissolve into mist, his voice fading. "When the church buries truth, it grows roots. You have heard them now. You cannot unhear them." Then he was gone. Mateo stood alone in the cold chamber, the candlelight from his trembling hand barely illuminating the old torture rope. It swayed slightly, as though moved by invisible breath. And then he saw it, faint letters scratched into the stone beside the device. Latin words, half erased by time, "Vox veritatis non vincitur." The voice of truth cannot be silenced. He traced the inscription with his fingers, heart pounding. The whispering around him grew louder, merging into a single chant, not of fear, but of revelation. It was as though the walls themselves prayed for redemption. He fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Then let me speak for you," he whispered. "Let me free the truth." When he emerged from the passage hours later, dawn was breaking over the city. The bells of St. Peter's tolled softly, but their sound felt different now, not triumphant, but mournful. Mateo looked toward the Vatican's golden dome, gleaming in the light, and saw it for what it was, not just a house of God, but a fortress built to hide the voices beneath. And somewhere deep below, the walls kept whispering, waiting for him to act. The bells of St. Peter's tolled at dawn, their echoes heavy with judgment. Father Mateo knelt before the crucifix in his chamber, his lips moving soundlessly. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the clarity that had come to him since the night in the catacombs. He knew now that truth was not a flame to guard, but one to release, even if it burned the hand that carried it. Outside, the courtyard filled with murmurs. Cardinals in crimson robes gathered like vultures circling a wounded saint. The tribunal had summoned him. No one dared speak to him directly, but their glances were knives, polished, silent, merciless. He rose and adjusted his robe. The air was thick with incense and tension. 2 guards approached, their armor gleaming, and led him through the long marble corridor toward the great hall. The path felt endless, lined with statues of saints whose gazes seemed to follow him, their stone eyes reflecting both pity and warning. When the doors opened, The hall swallowed him whole. At the center sat Cardinal Ferrante, his expression carved in cold authority. Beside him, the papal seal gleamed, a sun trapped in gold. "Father Mateo," Ferrante began, voice echoing like iron on stone. "You stand accused of heresy, of questioning the Holy Office, and of whispering forbidden words among the brethren." Mateo bowed slightly. "I spoke only what the walls themselves confessed." A ripple moved through the assembly, priests and clerics exchanging uneasy looks. Ferrante's eyes narrowed. "You claim the stones of the Vatican speak? You insult the sanctity of God's house with pagan superstition." "The walls remember," Mateo replied softly. "They hold the cries of those we condemned in his name. The truth still breathes beneath us." Ferrante rose from his seat, his voice rising. "Truth belongs to the Church. Without obedience, there is only chaos." Mateo met his gaze calmly. "Obedience without compassion is not faith. It is fear wearing a halo." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. A younger cardinal crossed himself. Somewhere in the chamber, the wind whispered faintly, though no windows were open. Mateo felt it again, the same chill that had touched him in the catacombs. Ferrante gestured sharply. "Bring forth the evidence." From the side doors, 2 guards carried in a bundle of aged rope, the same Strappado device Mateo had found below. The hall seemed to darken as it was placed before the tribunal. The rope, stiff with time, hung limp but heavy, like a serpent coiled in waiting. "This," Ferrante declared, "was discovered in the catacombs. You trespassed into forbidden chambers. You invoked spirits. You defiled the sanctity of relics." Mateo stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the rope. "That relic," he said, "is the confession of the Church itself." Gasps rippled again. Ferrante's face flushed crimson. "Enough. You will recant these blasphemies or face purification." "Then purify me," Mateo whispered. "But you cannot silence what has already spoken." Ferrante's hand slammed the table. "Guards!" 2 men seized Mateo's arms. He did not resist. He only looked upward, toward the fresco on the ceiling depicting the Last Judgment. Christ stood above the souls of men, dividing light from darkness. But as Mateo gazed, something strange happened. The candlelight flickered, and the colors of the fresco seemed to shift, the righteous blurred with the damned, halos fading into shadows. "Do you see?" Mateo said, voice trembling with both awe and sorrow. "Even heaven weeps for what we have done." "Silence him!" Ferrante hissed. The guards dragged Mateo backward, his sandals scraping across the marble floor. Yet before they could pull him through the doors, a sudden gust extinguished every candle in the hall. The room fell into total darkness. A whisper rose, faint, echoing, countless voices merging into one. "Vox veritatis non vincitor." The cardinals froze. Ferrante shouted for light, but his voice cracked. The rope on the table began to move, slowly, impossibly, as though drawn by unseen hands. It lifted, twisting upward, its frayed end swaying like a pendulum. A candle relit itself, and the flame burned blue. Mateo stared at it, unafraid. "You hear them now," he said quietly. "They only wanted truth." The guards released him. One fell to his knees, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Ferrante backed away, his face pale. "This is trickery. A demon's illusion." But deep inside, he could not deny what he saw, the rope rising, the whispers echoing through the very stones of the Vatican. When the lights returned, Mateo was gone. The chamber stood silent, the ancient rope lying still once more. Only Ferrante remained, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the fresco above, where for a fleeting second, the face of Christ seemed to have turned away. The narrow corridors beneath the Vatican smelled of damp stone and decay. Yet Mateo's steps were confident. He moved silently, guided by the whispering echoes of history itself. Each footfall seemed to awaken memories embedded in the walls, whispers of the tortured, the condemned, and the devout who had long since disappeared into the shadows. He reached a small alcove, hidden behind a tapestry depicting the martyrdom of saints. The fabric was moth-eaten and faded, but a faint shimmer of light revealed a trapdoor beneath. With trembling hands, Mateo pressed a hidden latch. The door swung open to reveal a spiral staircase descending into darkness. As he descended, the air grew colder. Candle sconces lined the walls, their wax hardened into grotesque shapes by centuries of neglect. Mateo lit one, the flickering flame revealing inscriptions carved into the stone, dates, names, and symbols. He traced them with his fingers, feeling the weight of every life chronicled in silence. At the bottom of the stairs lay a small chamber, dust-choked and untouched for 6 centuries. In the center, resting on a stone pedestal, was a codex bound in blackened leather, its cover embossed with a symbol of intertwined ropes and a crown. Mateo's pulse quickened. This was it, the Forbidden Gospel, a manuscript that chronicled not salvation, but the intricate evolution of suffering sanctioned by papal authority. Opening the codex, Mateo found pages filled with meticulous illustrations, figures suspended by ropes, annotated angles of joints, diagrams of weights, all demonstrating the mechanical and psychological precision of Strappado. Footnotes detailed how early practitioners calibrated agony without spilling blood, how they manipulated fear, anticipation, and hope to extract confession. The sophistication was horrifying. He read accounts of victims, their ages, social status, and reactions carefully noted. Peasants endured the full horror, while nobles received calibrated sessions that left them functional but intimidated. Mateo felt a chill. The text revealed an understanding of human psychology centuries ahead of its time. Learned helplessness, progressive revelation, and environmental manipulation were all documented. A systematic approach to breaking both body and spirit. The codex also contained accounts of Apollonia of Alexandria, whose resistance had inspired these refinements. Mateo's eyes widened as he traced the sequence: suspension, weights, incremental escalation, observation of others, all techniques the Church would perfect under Innocent IV. Her endurance had been studied, her suffering dissected as a guide to future inquisitors. Mateo realized the manuscript was not just history. It was a blueprint for terror, deliberately concealed for centuries. He felt the gravity of what he held, knowledge that could expose the Church's carefully hidden cruelty. Yet he also understood its value. The truth could not remain buried forever. He carefully turned the pages to a section on psychological conditioning. The text described methods to manipulate victims' perception of time, hunger, sleep, and social pressure. Inquisitors had noted how anticipation of pain could be more devastating than the pain itself, and how witnessing others suffer, particularly loved ones, would compound obedience and confession. The Codex even advised selecting torturers based on psychological aptitude, those capable of inflicting suffering while maintaining emotional detachment. Guided by ritual and religious justification, Mateo's mind reeled. Every detail of Strappado, every refinement of cruelty, every strategic application of terror, all had been studied, recorded, and hidden under the guise of faith. This knowledge had survived for 600 years, preserved to maintain control and obedience, yet buried to avoid scrutiny. As he read further, a sudden draft fluttered the pages, and Mateo felt the walls hum. Whispers rose faintly, familiar and yet distant. The voices of the lost, the condemned, the martyrs whose agony had been codified into this manuscript. Mateo bowed his head. He could not help but feel sorrow, reverence, and outrage all at once. He knew he could not simply leave the Codex here. To reveal it would risk his life, yet to hide it would perpetuate centuries of silence. Mateo made his decision. He would document, preserve, and ultimately reveal the manuscript, carefully, deliberately, ensuring the world could see both the mechanical ingenuity and the moral horror of what had been concealed. As he ascended the spiral staircase, codex in hand, Mateo felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him. Every step toward the surface was a step toward confrontation with the Church, with history, and with the moral responsibility he now bore. He emerged into the quiet corridors of the Vatican, the morning light filtering through the windows. Resolute in his purpose, truth would not remain hidden, not for another century, not for another lifetime. Mateo moved cautiously through the quiet streets of Rome, the codex securely wrapped in a velvet cloth. The city stirred around him, merchants calling their wares, priests hurrying to early masses, and the distant clatter of horse hooves echoing against stone streets. Yet despite the bustle, Mateo felt an isolation heavier than the shadows of the Vatican vaults. He carried not only an ancient manuscript but centuries of concealed cruelty, a truth powerful enough to shake the foundations of the Church itself. He had arranged a secret meeting with Isabella, a scholar sympathetic to his cause, in a secluded courtyard adorned with statues of forgotten saints. The courtyard smelled of damp marble and autumn leaves, the sunlight filtering through latticed arches creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the ground. Mateo arrived first, his eyes scanning every corner, every potential threat. Isabella emerged silently from the far end of the courtyard, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. Mateo greeted her with a grave nod, revealing the codex only after ensuring the space was empty. Her eyes widened as she recognized the embossed rope symbol. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, tracing the symbol with her fingertips. "Beneath the Vatican," Mateo replied, his voice tight with tension. "Hidden for 6 centuries. It's the complete record of the Strappado and the evolution of inquisitorial torture. Every refinement, every calculation, every psychological manipulation." Isabella turned the pages carefully. Detailed diagrams of suspension techniques, weights, and psychological protocols sprawled across vellum. Notes in faded ink described the manipulation of anticipation, the calculation of pain, and the systematic targeting of different social classes. Mateo watched her reactions closely, noting the shock and horror that flickered across her face. "We cannot allow this to remain hidden," Mateo said, urgency in his voice. "The Church must be held accountable, and the world deserves to know what was done in its name." Their plans were cautious. Mateo insisted on duplicating the codex first, creating fragile facsimiles for scholars and historians. They would circulate these copies anonymously, ensuring the manuscript's contents reached the public while protecting the original. Days turned into nights as Mateo and Isabella worked, the quiet courtyard echoing with the scratching of quills and the scent of ink and parchment. Meanwhile, within the Vatican, subtle alarms had been triggered. Rumors of the Codex's disappearance reached Cardinal Orsini, a man known for his ruthless dedication to preserving church authority. Orsini convened a small council of inquisitors, their faces grim. Aware that the exposure of such secrets could tarnish the Church's carefully cultivated moral image, the manuscript cannot leave these walls, Orsini decreed. Every effort must be made to recover it. Those responsible will answer for their negligence. The council nodded, their thoughts heavy with both fear and the desire to prevent scandal. Back in the courtyard, Mateo and Isabella completed the final facsimile. Isabella held the delicate copy, her hands trembling. Mateo looked at the streets beyond, aware that each passing moment increased the risk of discovery. "The Church will send its agents," he said quietly. "We must act tonight." As night fell, they moved through hidden alleys, avoiding the main roads, the codex wrapped carefully against Mateo's chest. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them. Every footstep echoed like a warning. The air was tense with anticipation, the kind that mirrored the psychological manipulations described in the manuscript itself. They reached a small ship docked along the Tiber. scheduled to carry the manuscript to a network of trusted historians in Florence. Mateo felt a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. The codex would leave Rome, but their mission was far from over. At dawn, a messenger arrived at the Vatican, bearing reports of sightings near the river. Cardinal Orsini's face tightened as he read the dispatches. The codex had escaped, and with it, centuries of hidden horrors would enter public knowledge. Orsini's mind raced with strategies: diplomacy, intimidation, and perhaps even clandestine retrieval. Mateo watched from the boat as Rome faded into the morning haze. The manuscript, once hidden in the dark vaults of the Vatican, was now on its way to illuminate centuries of concealed history. He thought of Apollonia, of every life chronicled in the codex, and felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. The journey of truth had begun, and the repercussions would ripple far beyond the stone walls of the church. The morning air in Rome was heavy with tension, carrying the distant clang of church bells that seemed unusually foreboding. Inside the Vatican, Cardinal Orsini paced his private chamber, the codex's disappearance weighing on him like a stone. Every detail had been meticulously planned, yet somehow centuries of secrecy had been breached. Orsini's sharp eyes scanned the room, settling on the gathered inquisitors, each looking back with a mixture of fear and determination. "The manuscript has left our walls," Orsini declared, his voice cold and precise. "We cannot allow its contents to reach the public. Not now, not ever. Our authority, the very foundation of the church, depends on containment." A murmur passed through the room, but none dared challenge him. Orsini continued, outlining a strategy of containment and retrieval. Inquisitors were dispatched across the city, their orders precise: locate Mateo, intercept the codex, and ensure no copies remained in circulation. Surveillance of scholars and historians was intensified, and discreet interrogations were initiated to root out any accomplices. Outside, Mateo and Isabella moved cautiously through Rome's winding streets, unaware of the nets tightening around them. Every footstep seemed louder in the early dawn, every shadow a potential threat. Mateo clutched the codex to his chest, feeling the pulse of history and the burden of responsibility. He knew that once Vatican agents discovered the facsimiles circulating among historians, the chase would escalate. The first encounter came in a narrow alley near the Pantheon. Mateo sensed movement behind a stone column and pressed Isabella to the wall. A hooded figure emerged, eyes scanning, hands reaching toward them. Mateo reacted instinctively, pushing Isabella behind him and darting toward a side street. The pursuer hesitated, then pursued, their cloak flaring in the dim morning light. Mateo led Isabella through twisting alleys and across small piazzas, the city itself seeming to conspire in their flight. Back at the Vatican, Orsini convened another council. Reports of sightings near the Tiber, whispered accounts of a man and woman carrying something precious, and even rumors of a hidden shipment to Florence fueled his determination. He leaned over the table, examining maps and coded letters, plotting the next moves like a chess master. Every possible route was considered, every ally and informant called upon. Meanwhile, Mateo and Isabella found refuge in a modest inn near the outskirts of Rome. The innkeeper, a quiet man with wary eyes, provided them with a room that overlooked the cobblestone street below. Mateo placed the codex on a sturdy table, brushing dust from the velvet covering, and sighed. The weight of the centuries of cruelty chronicled within was tangible, pressing down like a physical burden. "We can't stay here long," Mateo said, tension tightening his jaw. "They'll send agents in waves and we have to stay ahead." Isabella nodded, her fingers tracing the codex's edge. "But the world needs to see this. The church cannot continue hiding these atrocities." Their discussion was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Both froze, eyes meeting in silent alarm. Mateo approached cautiously, motioning Isabella to step back. Peering through the peephole, he saw a figure, seemingly ordinary, yet the very air suggested danger. He decided against opening the door, instead signaling to Isabella to prepare for immediate departure. Night fell, and the city transformed into a labyrinth of shadows. Mateo and Isabella slipped through the silent streets, the codex securely carried, hearts pounding. The streets near the Vatican were unusually quiet, the guards alert, torches casting elongated, flickering shadows. Every corner could harbor a spy. Every echo could signal pursuit. Meanwhile, Orsini was not idle. He had called upon secretive agents known only to the highest echelons of the Church, men trained in pursuit, subterfuge, and intelligence gathering. They moved like shadows tracing the faintest whispers, listening for rumors of facsimiles, intercepting coded letters between scholars, and eliminating loose ends before the knowledge could spread further. As Mateo and Isabella navigated toward a safe house, they became increasingly aware of the psychological weight of their mission. The Codex was more than a manuscript. It was a symbol of centuries of concealed cruelty, and carrying it made them targets. Mateo felt the echo of every torturous session chronicled within, a reminder of the stakes, not just for them, but for every person silenced by history. In the dead of night, they reached the outskirts of the city and observed the distant glow of Florence in the horizon. The first facsimile had already been dispatched via trusted couriers, and the manuscript's journey toward exposure had begun. Yet the shadows behind them never truly dissipated. Mateo knew that the Vatican's reach was long, its patience deep, and that the struggle for truth would demand every ounce of cunning and courage they possessed. Rome, a city steeped in centuries of power, faith, and secrecy, seemed to hold its breath as two individuals carried history on their shoulders. The Codex, once hidden beneath stone vaults, now traveled toward the light, but not without evoking the full might of an institution, desperate to maintain control. The first rays of sunlight spilled over the rooftops of Florence, illuminating the Arno River with a golden shimmer. Mateo and Isabella had arrived under the cover of night, their journey from Rome marked by constant vigilance, whispered fears, and the looming shadow of the Vatican. Now standing before a trusted group of scholars and historians in a secluded study. The Codex lay on the center table, its worn leather cover carrying centuries of secrets. Mateo's hands trembled slightly as he carefully removed the cloth wrapping, revealing the manuscript that had been hidden for over 600 years. The room was hushed, the only sound the faint rustle of pages as Isabella opened the Codex to the first meticulously handwritten entry. Candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the walls, emphasizing the weight of the knowledge contained within. "This," Mateo began, voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "is more than a record of history. It is a testament to the consequences of unchecked power." His eyes swept across the room, meeting those of scholars who had dedicated their lives to truth. Some visibly shocked, others deeply contemplative. Outside, the city began to awaken, unaware of the monumental disclosure unfolding within its walls. Couriers had already been dispatched to major academic centers across Europe, copies of the facsimiles traveling in secret, ensuring that the story of centuries-long concealment would reach every corner of the learned world. The scholars pored over the Codex, their expressions shifting between horror and fascination as they read detailed accounts of the Strappado and other inquisitorial methods. Mateo and Isabella watched closely, gauging reactions, aware that each revelation carried the potential to shake faith, challenge authority, and spark debates that would resonate for decades. News of the Codex's exposure spread like wildfire. From Paris to Vienna, scholars debated, clergy protested, and lay people absorbed accounts that had long been suppressed. Letters and treatises circulated rapidly, some defending the Church, others condemning the centuries of secrecy and cruelty. The ripple effects of one manuscript reshaped historical discourse almost overnight, yet the shadow of the Vatican remained. Cardinal Orsini had been alerted, and his agents moved swiftly, attempting to track down the source of the breach and contain the narrative. Rumors of the Codex's journey reached him through informal networks, and the tension within the Vatican corridors grew palpable. Orsini understood that history was no longer under his control. The Codex had escaped, and with it, the power to dictate the past. Mateo and Isabella, though relieved to have delivered the Codex into capable hands, were acutely aware that the danger was far from over. Messages of gratitude and admiration arrived alongside warnings of pursuit and threats, reinforcing the reality that their mission had forever altered the balance of institutional secrecy. As the weeks passed, the Codex became a focal point of historical study, its contents meticulously analyzed, translated, and cross-referenced. Scholars highlighted the meticulous psychological strategies employed during inquisitorial tortures, the social manipulation, and the systematic nature of the Church's methods. Mateo's warnings to those around him, that knowledge alone could empower but also provoke, resonated through lecture halls and salons alike. In private moments, Mateo reflected on the personal cost of their endeavor. Nights spent evading pursuit, the constant fear of capture, and the burden of carrying centuries of violence weighed heavily. Yet he also recognized the profound significance of what they had accomplished. Truth had emerged from concealment, and the Codex's secrets would inform and caution generations to come. Isabella, equally burdened but resolute, remarked one evening as they observed the Arno River in twilight, "We've illuminated the darkness, Mateo. What was hidden for centuries now stands in the light. And though the Church will resist, history will remember." Indeed, the final act of their journey was not one of confrontation, but of revelation. The Codex, once a tool of suppression and terror, had transformed into an instrument of awareness, education, and moral reckoning. Its exposure prompted reforms in scholarly circles, inspired debates on institutional accountability, and provided a framework for understanding the mechanisms through which power could perpetuate cruelty. Rome, though distant, felt the shockwaves. Reports of unrest, whispered dissent, and renewed scholarly inquiry forced the Vatican to reckon with its historical choices. Orsini's meticulously orchestrated control over history had been irrevocably compromised. The Codex had liberated truth, challenging authority and affirming the resilience of human curiosity and courage. By the time the sun dipped below the Tuscan hills, Mateo and Isabella stood at the riverbank, Codex secured within a trusted archive. The journey that began in secrecy and fear had reached its culmination. They had preserved the past, exposed injustice, and ensured that the lessons of history would endure. And though danger still lingered in the shadows, they understood that light, once cast, could not easily be extinguished.